Malagasy and the people actually too. The the origin is kind of, I wouldn't say unknown, but not exactly clear. But what they believe is that Malagasy kind of come from Africa and Indonesia and Malaysia in that area. And so I say they're African. A lot of people say, no, they're not African because it's not actually attached to Africa. But it's kind of a combination of that. And so the people don't necessarily look like your typical African. Some of them do, but some of them may look more like Polynesian. And so the effect of that on the language, it is more of a Polynesian language. It's from the Austronesian language family. And so that includes things like Malay, Indonesian, Fijian, Tongan, Samoan, those types of things. Those types of languages, there are a lot of similarities between the languages. The numbers, counting. And so the language itself is more Polynesian than African. It's not like, what's that word? Swahili. There are, it might be a little bit similar. So it shares a lot of similarities with random languages. It has Arabic influence as well. Apparently, the days of the week in Malagasy are numbers 1 through 7 in Arabic. One of my missionaries taught us that because he learned Arabic before his mission. But the language itself is pretty simple. I mean, I say that and people think, oh, it's a language. It's not simple. And they're right. I mean, learning a new language isn't easy. But I think if I had a choice, I would choose something like Malagasy over, say Finnish or any of the languages. European languages are really difficult to learn just by the nature of the way the language is constructed. But Malagasy is very basic. You don't have any conjugation per se. When you think of conjugation in English, you think of like I go, you went or they went, or it changes with each pronoun. You're going to have that conjugation of the verb, whereas in Malagasy the conjugation doesn't change. So if I say I go or you go, the only thing that's changing is the pronoun, and the verb is exactly the same. So also very nice thing about it is when you have a verb, well, first of all, the verbs start with the letter M. So you know what a verb is because it's going to start with M, which is convenient, but also confusing because they're like, oh, well, everything starts with M, so it's hard to differentiate. But if you want to make it past tense, you change it to an N. So, for example, the word mamaki is the word to read. And so if you want to, like past tense, you just change the M to an N and it becomes namaki. And then that's all you change. And then, the rest of your sentence. And then if you want to make it future, you change that M to an H. So it would be hamaki. So that's convenient. It's difficult for missionaries at times because they think, oh, I need another word. Like in English, you'd say, I will read. But there's no word for that. You just change the letter. So it takes a little bit to get used to. There also is no to be verb in Malagasy. So is, am, are doesn't exist, which is also difficult for missionaries to grasp. They think, well, I need that word. Like, no, you don't. Just forget about it. And so a lot of times they'll ask, like, what's the word for is? Like, there isn't one. Just, it takes a while to get used to. And then I don't think it's difficult sentence structure wise, but sometimes missionaries will struggle with it because it's different. Is that in English we have it's called an SVO structure, from a linguistics perspective, meaning when you have a sentence in English, you start with your subject, you move to your verb, and then you end with your object. But in Malagasy, you start with your verb. And so you start with your verb, and then you move to your object, and then you finish your sentence with your subject. So something like, if you use mamaki again, if I said, I read the Book of Mormon, I'd say mamaki ni Book ni Mormona au. And so I read the Book of Mormon, I. And so getting used to that structure as well is something that missionaries struggle with because they're used to starting with their subject. So a lot of times they'll forget it. And so they'll do one of two things. First of all, they'll try to say it like an English sentence, which isn't according to that structure. It still makes sense in a way, and in casual speech, they will probably use that eventually, but they need to learn the structure to begin with. Or they'll have their verb and their object, but they'll have no subject. And so when they're teaching me or practicing, I'm like, okay, I understand what you're saying, And I would maybe understand it in context, but you need to make sure that whoever is doing that is put at the end of the sentence so that it makes sense. So yeah, it's a little different in that way. And so, now maybe missionaries think, okay, now that's complicated, but compared to other languages, it's very simple. And we don't have it in English, but some languages have a case system, meaning that, they have a word, and then depending on what the function of that word is in the sentence, it's going to have a different ending attached to it. And so, the poor Finnish missionaries or Estonian missionaries that are learning those languages, they have to memorize, 14 different endings or whatever it is, depending on the function of the word in the sentence. So, I think it's, in that comparison, it's very easy, but still, it's a new language. Learning the ins and outs and understanding obviously takes a while. You don't just understand it to begin with. But it's, somewhat unique in that way.